Welcome, you all. This is your boy, Baron, and I'm here with David Masters today for a new episode of Disrupt the Drift. We have a great question at hand. Before we get started, I want to just invite you, request of you that you share the show, be a part of this movement of sharing anything you get from the show. If you get some kind of wisdom or some kind of new thinking, some kind of breakthroughs or openings or expansion or development in yourself, something good from it, share it, pay it forward. The world needs it. And it's your way of supporting what we're up to and being a part of what we're up to. Also on YouTube, check out Disrupt the Drift on YouTube. And we're dropping these episodes twice a week. About twice a week if you want the visual part of this show. If you're listening to it on audio, that works too. We're on most platforms. So, as David, how are you doing today?
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah.
I have a question. Should we just jump into it?
Let's go.
All right. So this is from a question someone sent in. Also, you all send in your questions to Disrupting the Drift at baronbaptiste.com. Disrupting the Drift at Baron Baptiste. That's disrupting with an ing. Disrupting the Drift at baronbaptiste.com. We've kind of updated the title of the show to Disrupt the Drift. A little confusing initially because you're going to still need to email at Disrupting the Drift. But yeah, YouTube, Disrupt the Drift. Podcast will be Disrupt the Drift, and emailing at disruptingthedrift at baronbaptiste.com. Send in your questions. That gives us an opportunity to interact with you with real stuff, real things you're dealing with, real situations with real people in real life. We want it to be real here, and it's a place where we can tell the truth and get real with real situations in your life. Okay, here's the question. Thank you for doing this podcast. It's made a real difference for me in many parts of my life. My question is that I feel stuck and like I'm just drifting along in many areas of my life. I've made changes to my daily habits, but still feel dominated by the feeling of drifting along in my life. And I sense there's something I'm missing. How do I impact the drift? How do I alter the drift so that I can live a more creative life? It's a good question.
I love that question. It's very powerful, and it's super important because most people have this issue going on in their lives, no matter how much counter programming you do to try to disrupt the drift. The drift is going to continue, and I can give you a practical concept. And that is when I was learning how to fly small aircraft, there was always this problem of dealing with the wind that was pushing you one way or another. And of course, when you're flying or when you're sailing, there's always going to be forces at work on you that are trying to push you off of your intended direction. And so nobody in their life actually wants to fail in any way, shape, or form. Nobody has a conscious desire not to meet the goals that they have or to find a way to achieve the things that they want to achieve. But there's always forces at work on us. And so when I was flying a small airplane, you always had to correct for the wind that was blowing you in whatever direction the wind was blowing you. If you're going against the wind, if you're going sideways to a wind, it's blowing you off course. And this wind is what I will call conditioning. And I went ahead and I searched for the word conditioning, the meaning of the word, and what pops up on psychologistworld.com. Conditioning. What is conditioning? What Pavlov's dog's experiment teaches us about how we learn. Essentially, conditioning is behavioral psychology, and that is a reaction or response to an object or event, stimulus, by a person that can be modified by learning or conditioning. Now, that sounds very psychological, and it is, but the fact is that we are malleable from even before the time we come into this world. And I don't know if you've ever seen women with child playing classical music to the child in the womb, they're actually beginning to help the brain form before the child is born. But what if you're surrounded by negative influences, whether you realize it or not, whether the people in the environment that are bringing you into the world, whether they realize it or not, there are influences all around us, and those influences are conditioning us even before we reach the world. Now, when we get here, the problem is that we begin instantly to absorb the environment and whatever it is that's in that environment, and then we adopt this environmental identity as if it were who we are. And so as we go through life, the struggle, and this is the wind that constantly pushes against us and pushes us off course to being a unique version of ourselves, to be an original version of us, an authentic version of ourselves. There's a constant force at work pushing us off course from authenticity and discovering the purpose for which we came into this world. And this is the conflict that every human being struggles with. And so no matter how much counter conditioning or counter programming you apply, if you don't understand that you're constantly being pushed in a direction, whatever that direction may be, then you're going to struggle against it without success. And I want to hear your thoughts on that, Baron.
Yeah, very good. It's what I'm hearing you speak to is the external forces.
Yes.
The external conditions that we are impacted by, the conditions that train us to be certain kinds of ways that are, so you could back up and say, I think it's somewhere in Eastern philosophy, I think maybe it was the yogis that said that when we're born with our own river, our own flow. And then there are forces in the world that alter that flow, that natural flow that we are born with, that we have at least an access to. And then if your outer environment and outer conditioning, starting in your own home, your parents, your family environment in which you grew up, that's a condition. Then you go off to school and you're further conditioned by school and peer pressure and other kids and what to do to fit in or don't do because you might be laughed at, or we learn pretty quickly what to do to fit in to this, some other flow, some other river beyond our own. And sometimes those outer forces are very dominant, very powerful. Sometimes we can be in environments that are more encouraging for us to follow our own flow. It seems like more than ever, there's the outer pressure, the outer pressures to fit in and to be a part of the sea of all the same, to be in kind of the river of society, the river of life that is inherited, and then we adopt that. It's inherited and adopted, and we adopt into other people's flows, and then we take on these external kind of ways of existing. And more, there's a greater gap between our own flow. And at a certain point in life, I know in my life, at a certain point, started waking up and realizing, wait, I'm not living my own life. I'm living a life that I've adopted from my parents, from society, from the school, from schooling to peers, to friends, to fitting in. You learn what to do and what not to do pretty quickly. You learn if you do certain things, society or just friends or teachers or parents will disapprove. And it takes an awakening, is what I want to say, an awakening. And suddenly we find ourselves, though, when we wake up, we find ourselves in a river, like on a boat. You're on a river following this flow, this drift. You're drifting along. And now you can keep attempting to update improving yourself. You can do things better. You can do things better, or do more of certain things that you've learned that you should be doing. You do them better than others, compete, be competitive in the world to demonstrate that you can be successful inside of or on top of the drift, let's say. But I think when you bring up this conditioning, that now we're getting to step back and look at the context, the bigger context for your life, or said in a different way, what's in the background that's pulling you and pushing you, that's gone unexamined, and you're inside of a context, something where you're coming from isn't out of some kind of conscious choice or conscious awareness. It's unconscious, and it's moving you and determining what you do and what you don't do, what you say, what you don't say, and you're not free. You're not free. What say you, David, about this whole drift? We find ourselves on this river on a boat cruising along, and maybe we get a bigger boat, a better boat. We refine the boat. We do more and do things better, but we're still on the same drift, same river, same flow. Yeah. That's not our own.
I love this concept of the river, because the river has a current, and the current moves from one direction to another. It doesn't reverse itself, by the way. Rivers don't flow upstream, they flow downstream, right? And so if you're in the river of your conditioning, you're going to go downstream with the current. And so this is what we're all fighting with. I used airplane because airplane has elements of subtle correction, which is all that's needed. If you overcorrect, then you flip your airplane upside down, or you go way off course. So overcorrection is never the way of dealing with the issues that are confronting us on an everyday basis. But becoming aware, as you said, that you're not living your own life, that's the beginning of what I will call dehypnosis or deconditioning, where you start to question, why am I doing this? What is it about me that keeps me going back over and over, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting some kind of different outcome? There's a problem. Drift. That's a drift. It's a complete drift.
Yeah.
So I wanted to read to you the actual definition of what Pavlov discovered about conditioning. He didn't discover conditioning.
Who was Pavlov?
Okay, so here's what I'm going to read to you.
Okay.
The mode of learning, this discovery of conditioning, the mode of learning was demonstrated by the experiments of Ivan Pavlov. He was a Russian scientist back in the early 1900s, okay? He decided to research conditioning after discovering during separate gastric tests, in other words, when they were feeding dogs, his dog began to salivate not only when meat powder was presented to them, but more significantly, when the person feeding them came into proximity with them. The dogs had been inadvertently trained through what's called classical conditioning to associate the person feeding them with the food itself, and reacted in a similar way in salivating as if they're going to be fed to the feeders. This is known as stimulus response, when salivation becomes a responsive action to the stimulus of the person feeding the dogs. Now, we come into the world. Who are our feeders? Mom and dad, or whoever it is that takes care of us. We develop a bond with those people, because that's where our life force, literally our ability to live, comes from those who feed us. Now, not only are they feeding us food, but they're feeding us environmental factors, culture, whatever it may be. They're feeding us the culture of the family. And our mind and our bodies are both being fed by the same people. And then at a certain point, we get turned over to other handlers. And those other handlers are people who we are being taught by in school. And you mentioned this. Authority figures, right?
Experts, yeah.
But see, within us, and I want to make a point about what Dr. Bruce Lipton said, a brilliant man. when he was talking about how to improve your life, and he said, in the first 5 to 7 years of our life, we have to have some conditioning in order to have something to overcome. Now, that makes perfect sense because none of us are necessarily born into a perfect environment. Most of us are not. Most of us are born into a world in which we are, I call myself an experimental guinea pig. My mom, I was the first of 5 kids. I was an experimental guinea pig. They learned everything to do and not to do with the other 4 kids from dealing with me. So we're all, in a sense, the experimental child. No matter how many children, people are always learning how to raise children better or do the same things over and over again, expecting a different outcome. But we have to have conditioning in our lives, and that begins with whatever our environment is, to overcome. But the question then arises, are we aware enough to know that there is a potentially different destiny or an authentic identity within us waiting to be born? And this is what is said in the scripture. And again, I'm not trying to freak anybody out, but Jesus said this, marvel not when I say you must be born again. Now, this is where it begins with the idea that you feel uncomfortable. Something is wrong. Something feels wrong in your life. And you begin to now search for what it is that makes you feel that way. Why do I feel something is wrong in my life? But see, the answer to that is the most important answer that you can ever find. And I want to throw it back to you.
Yeah, very good. Buddha said, defy the stream. Defy the stream.
There it is.
What is that? Yeah, let's unpack that a little bit. So what is it to defy the stream? There are 2 things that come to mind to me, come to mind right here, is conditioning. How are you conditioned to wake up and take a look? What have you been taught? Like one of Pavlov's dogs, you learn, you act certain ways and you do certain things, and then you're rewarded with food or toys or what have you. Fit in. Okay, so what's your conditioning? Who have you been conditioned to be? What beliefs, what points of view, what outlooks on your life or on life? What about life? What have you adopted? Just going along through life, starting as a little person, as a young person, you've adopted certain ways of viewing yourself, what you're good at, what you're not good at. You're a good person, you're a bad person. All these, if you do certain things, then you're good. If you do other things, you're bad. Okay, now there's truth in that, perhaps, but it may be mal-informed. Likely it is. It's not, because you've adopted others' beliefs. You've adopted other people's ways of thinking, other people's ways of living life. And if it's your parents, maybe they did what they thought was best for you. Maybe in their own way, they loved you, and so they taught you and trained you in certain ways of behaving, certain ways of acting, certain ways of being, to get along in life, to be successful in life. Even when maybe they weren't successful, they taught you to do things that they didn't actually do themselves, or they lived through their life through you. So to wake up to all of that. The second thing is that comes to mind in really impacting the drift is action, but not any kind of action, because we've all done enough of acting, taking action to change a habit. When we do we have addictions, or we have certain kinds of eating poorly, thinking poorly, reacting poorly in situations. We take on certain practices that we just keep doing more and more. So it's not any kind of action. But here's my point. It's coming back to Buddha's statement of defy the stream. I say, when you really get present to your conditioning and you look at, well, what kind of action would actually defy the stream? And I say this, you need to redirect the current of your whole life. How do you do that? If you look at how does someone look at, how do you control, how do certain, okay, you live in a certain area and they control the water flow. They put up a dam, right? So you put up a dam, it stops the current, it stops the flow. Or you put in certain measures to redirect the current. They'll to redirect a river, because if they either have a dam to protect the people that live below the dam there that would be impacted and destructed. So they redirect the current. And those are certain kind of actions that you look in the big picture, because you can keep taking actions, just changing daily habits. Okay, now I'm going to put myself on a diet. I'm going to restrict what I eat. I'm going to do different things or more things or better things. But if you're still inside of the same, or on top of the same, being swept by the same current of the past, it's still the drift. So it's getting more to the source and redirecting the whole current of your life. And so, and if the drift is taking you in a place where it's predictable, a predictable future of getting you more of the same and nothing really changing other than maybe changing toward the direction you don't want to be going, you either put up a dam or you redirect the flow, the current. And I think getting present and waking up to your conditioning and taking new action from the source of the flow is really what it takes. Now, it's easy to say all that, but what does that look like? How do you actually redirect? Yeah, what say you, David?
Let's break it down a little bit more. Because after Pavlov did his experiments with dogs, another psychologist came along. His name was, in 1938, B.F. Skinner, carried out an experiment with caged rats in an operant conditioning chamber, and they called it Skinner's box. And he learned through operant conditioning that if they pressed on a lever, food would be released to these rats. And then under operant conditioning, reinforcement played a key role. What we don't realize is that, in a sense, and maybe you've felt this before, but maybe you have felt this sense that you're like a rat in an experiment, okay? And that doesn't mean in a negative way, that you just feel like somebody's experimenting with your mind. And here is just, I want to just make it really simple. There are two kinds of reinforcement types. And the first is a positive reinforcement. For example, you get rewarded. If you do well, you get a star on your report, or you get a candy, or you get a pat on the back. So this is positive reinforcement, and a stimulus is introduced which incentivizes a particular behavior. How many people have had that experience? Everybody has, right? Where you get something as a reward for behaving a certain way. The other side of the equation is negative reinforcement, which is a desirable incentive is introduced to not behave a certain way. Now, look what's happening. The cancel culture, and we have the whole strange phenomenon of people using disincentives for people to get involved with whatever particular cause they believe in. And then there are different kinds of punishments, right? For example, we look at what's happened in political circles, the January 6th thing, and this is called a positive punishment. An undesirable punishment is introduced when the subject behaves in a particular way, discourages such behavior. So what do? We have all these either positive or negative reinforcements that are constantly chipping away at our ability to think for ourselves. And to think for ourselves is the ultimate enemy of mass control. Matthias Desmet wrote a book called Mass Formation Psychosis. And I have to tell you that I believe that most people are involved in some degree of mass formation psychosis, which means if you're at work and somebody starts talking about how much they can't stand a particular politician or person, suddenly you find yourself being drawn into agreement with them, even if it's not something that you actually agree with. But you want to fit in, as you were saying, Baron. You want to fit in and not be identified as a person who is an outlier or a person who is divergent, who is not going to be a part of the groupthink. And so there are constant forces.
Just chirp in here,
Yeah.
that is being rewarded, right? You're getting the approval
Exactly.
of a peer or of the group. You're
Yeah.
getting the approval. And the flip side is you're avoiding the wrath. You're avoiding the attacks. You're avoiding something, and you're seeking the approval of something or someone else. And you essentially are being your way of living, your way of being is being determined by these external forces, which then creates that gap inside yourself, that further deepening of the experience of having lost yourself. And the way out, the only way out is truth. Living by truth, right?
Yeah.
And in living by truth, you will you'll come face to face with your conditioning of the past. You'll come face to face with, okay, do I keep taking these actions? Okay, I'm going to agree to go along and get the approval. And it's so unconscious and so quick and so automatic, but it's rooted in some kind of old conditioning, some kind of drifting along of how to survive in your environment, how to survive, and how not to be, punished, or how not to be ruined or an outcast. But the conditioning to fit in culturally, with groups, with peers, it's very subtle and very hardwired in to old conditioning. The truth goes against the grain. And when you live by truth, you're suddenly put in a situation or a position where you're being confronted not only externally by the external voices and forces, but also internally, you're confronting and being confronted by your own past. It feels scary. It feels threatening. It feels dangerous to go against the grain and live by the light of truth, that in congruence with your conscience, which inherently is going to disrupt the drift of just going along to get along, or the drift of relationships, or the drift in thinking, the drift in how you work and operate and flow. So it takes something, is my point here. It takes something, and it takes courage is one thing it takes as well.
So
to stand in the face of opposition,
yes,
and no agreement.
But the problem here is this, and this is a very strange idea to consider, but everybody naturally tends toward not only their own conditioning, but also applying whatever it is that they have been conditioned to be or not be to everyone around them. And it's a strange idea, because you would think naturally people, like when you see children playing, children tend to be more inclined to share toys and to work together. If you see children on a playground, but then there's a bully that emerges, and the bully seeks out a child to bully. And so that child has already themselves been bullied. So I want to go a little bit deeper into this idea that the conditioning that we all have is playing havoc with our lives. And this is at the bottom of this article from psychologistworld.com on Pavlovian conditioning. It says, conditioning has numerous practical applications in everyday training and education. Animal training routinely uses conditioning with food treats as a form of positive reinforcement for good behavior. I see a lady with her dog, and whenever there's another dog, she gives it a treat, and it forgets the dog that it's going to bark at. Now, here's the dark side of it. Generalization of association. A danger, particularly of the positive punishments described above, is that the subject may begin to associate an undesirable reinforcement with stimuli beyond those originally intended. This was demonstrated in Skinner's Little Albert experiment, in which Albert heard a loud noise on the sight of a white rat. So he sees a white rat, he hears a loud noise that kind of traumatizes him, shocks him. However, in addition to an aversion to white rats, Albert gained a phobia of anything that resembled it, including, for example, white beards. See how many associations that we have Think
Yeah.
about the
Yeah.
associations we have with either positive or negative reinforcement from conditioning. We are all conditioned, reflex response operational, which means
Yeah.
everything that we are up to a certain point when we begin to realize that we are living our lives that way and it doesn't feel right. And we then begin the struggle of, and I love what you said about what I think it was, who was it said that the pain you feel is the breaking of the egg that contains.
The shell that encloses you. Yeah.
Yeah. When we start to feel this pain, now you can, and you see these xylazine zombies in San Francisco and Seattle, and they're there. They're like the living dead because what they've done is they've gone so far away of realizing why they're so miserable. And the more miserable they are about not living their own lives, the deeper they go into some kind of heavy drug use, whatever it may be, or some kind of addiction of some form, and it's also food and other things, to help them escape their inability to identify the source of their unhappiness. See?
Yeah, very good. Let me just say this one thing about that is I think that because people are always addressing, well, drugs are the problem. It's actually for individuals who are addicted to those kind of substances, drugs actually aren't the problem. Drugs are the solution.
Yeah.
Right. It's to move away from the pain and the pain of not being able to deal with life, to deal with your past conditioning. And the world is full of false solutions, right? Social media is just full of these people that really haven't done anything in their own lives, but they've got the answers. They've got the solutions to your problems. It's this diet, or do this course, or do this kind of program, and then the world gives drugs is an opportunity, or plant medicine has become so popular now. They call it plant medicine. It's basically drugs repackaged in medicine, but that's some kind of hack to improving one's life. I don't know. I don't do that stuff, but I can say that if you haven't gotten to the bottom of what's actually driving you and that conditioning, and what you're speaking to, David, is the conditioning and all the associations that go along with it. For an example, I had a teacher, Miss Decker. This was like second grade, third grade-ish. But I remember my parents would travel quite a bit and take me with them. So I'd miss like school for 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time sometimes. When I'd come back to school, this teacher would really openly humiliate me in class.
Yeah.
This teacher would punish beyond just me, the teacher would stomp around angry, often just angry and stomping around the room. And it trained us to operate out of fear and walking around on eggshells in that room. But here's my point. I realized at some point in my early 20s, I had a lot of fear of authority figures, especially women that had a certain kind of look and way of acting or way of being about them. They were strict and stern, and you could tell they were on the edge of, like, real quick. If you didn't do what they said, you would get their wrath.
Yeah.
But what I realized is I was projecting that onto these certain type of people, that women of a certain kind of look. And I realized this person isn't Miss Decker, and they actually don't even have wrath there's no potential threat here for me, but I'm acting still in that same way as if I was in second or third grade. Mm-hmm. And I had to wake up to them like, no, wait, these people, this is something out of my own conditioning.
Yes.
Like that you're speaking to association.
Yeah.
Or my father was somewhat of an authoritarian and strong male figures. I just had this underlying resentment. And I didn't know what it was. When I would I took a job with a strong man, and he was correcting me all of the time. It was your dad, actually. And I started seeing, though, I had this kind of resentment that I didn't even want it. Like, I appreciated his criticism. He was criticizing me all of the time. it was well deserved, actually, because he was developing me, helping me wake up and how to be more effective, more productive in my job. But I realized there's some reason I'm like, what is this resentment that's there when I actually don't even want that? But I realized it was something to do with my father, and it was lingering. It was part of my conditioning in the background that anyone who appeared, any male that appeared strong and making strong requests or demands of me, immediately there was some projection happening. It was association. Is that what you're pointing to when you say association? Yeah.
And association with another word, activation. And so let's talk about the Manchurian Candidate for a moment, because the Manchurian Candidate was conditioned.
What is that for people who don't know? What is the Manchurian Candidate?
The Manchurian Candidate was based on a classic film. Actually, I think it was Frank Sinatra who originally was involved in making of the film, about the prisoners of war that were captured in North Korea back in the 50s. And they used hypnotic experiments on them. They got them to smoke marijuana. And then what they did was, under hypnosis in the story, they would do anything that they were told because they believed that it was their own idea. And for example, one person was told, I need you to take and shoot your friend in the head. And he was given a pistol, and he walked over and shot the guy in the head and sat back down and smoked a cigarette as if nothing happened. So what happens in classical conditioning is that there is a loss of freedom of your own will. And that freedom of your own will is surrendered over a long period of time, although conditioning can actually cause you to surrender your will very quickly. And that's how hypnotists work, by the way. A hypnotist will walk into a room and he'll see a person who has, those sparkling eyes that looks at that person as if they have an answer, and they say, go to sleep. And that person immediately is gone. And I've seen this happen. But the person surrenders their own identity, their will, their sense of who they are in a moment. And they're willing to do that. Now, if you're not willing to surrender your will to a hypnotic influence, doesn't matter what that influence is. But if you are malleable, which I started saying in the beginning, we're all malleable, we're all shapeable, and the psycho-operatives of the world understand that completely, and we don't, then the associations, like you were describing with people, and everybody has them, by the way, everybody has an association with somebody that has been terrible to them, and so then they either become instantly susceptible to those people's influences, or the second word I want to use is aversion. So then you have aversions to dealing with those kinds of people, as you were describing. And I know that I've had those absolutely exactly. When I was in 6th grade, I had a typing class, and the teacher was a very angry guy. And so one day I was sitting there and I started making like little bird sounds. I heard a bird outside the window and I started going, and he got angry at me and came over and slammed my head on the typewriter, and I literally had a cut on my forehead. What that did to me was, typing is bad. There's the association. I didn't want to learn how to type. I didn't want to learn how to do anything at that point. 6th grade, right? I'm 12 years old, 13 maybe?
Yeah.
So the associations are all in there, and there are tendrils. There's little invisible threads that tie us. In Gulliver's Travels, the Lilliputians had him tied down with little tiny threads, enough to make him struggle to have to get up. There is a struggle to awaken. And it's the statement about the pain that you feel is the breaking of the shell. There's a shell that encloses all of us. It's the shell of our own mind, our own thinking. And there must be a struggle to wake up. By the way, the struggle is not a bad thing necessarily, because a chicken that cannot peck its way through the shell, a little baby chick, is not destined to go on to be a bigger chicken. There are limitations on all of our potentials that are within our grasp. What we don't realize is we can peck our way through that shell. Maybe it is painful. Maybe it's difficult. In the work that I'm doing right now, I find that there is a huge turnover of people who just can't hack it. And it's not even that difficult of a position for them to be in, but I've seen like an overturn of people coming and going. And I'm thinking to myself, they just gave up. They didn't even try. They didn't try to overcome the difficulty that they were facing. It wasn't a terrible difficulty, but they wanted something comfy. They wanted something easy. They wanted something that didn't challenge them to grow.
Yeah.
And so we need that challenge to grow. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Two things on what you're speaking to right here is difficulty shapes us, and it can shape us we can use difficulty. We can use suffering to actually grow. It's a friction that allows us to dig deeper, to pull forth our own learning, discovering for ourselves how to thrive. It gives us a background on which to have the contrast to actually grow from. But there's some kind of acceptance of suffering that we need to be okay with. There's truth. There's the acceptance of suffering, that you use it rather than being used by it. The second thing that you pointed to is when the associations, so our conditioning, and we have these different associations, whatever that is. It's someone who reminds us of something of the past, or just like you said, white beards, or certain features of a person, certain characteristics of a person or a situation that remind us of something from the past. And it dictates what we do or don't do, or who we're being or not being in the present. But this is the point I want to bring forward is you said it, is we think that we are thinking for ourselves. Like the guy in the Manchurian Candidate who, they put a gun in front of him, and somehow they whispered in, that guy needs to go. He stands up, he goes, shoots the guy, and he actually believes it's his own idea.
Yes.
This is where it gets very, I was going to say dangerous, but this is where the rubber meets the road, right? It's where we have the opportunity in those moments to see, wait, am I actually thinking for myself, or am I doing, like, unconsciously thinking as though this is my own idea?
Now, let me inject this.
Yeah.
Another A word, anxiety. Now, there's two kinds of anxiety. The one anxiety is that a person who's told to pick up a gun and shoot somebody else in the head could feel innately, naturally, that there's something wrong with that idea, no matter what, right? And this is how they make converts, by the way. There was a movie that Leonardo DiCaprio made called Blood Diamond. And the way that they converted these young South African boys to becoming soldiers for this revolution was that they would take and blindfold one of them, take one of their friends and put them against a wall, put a weapon in the hand of the blindfolded boy and say, shoot. Then they would take the blindfold off and say, look, you just killed your friend. That person is damaged for the rest of their life. They're thrown into a state of self-doubt. And it's a very painful thing to watch because, in a way, we've all been conditioned to do things against our better judgment. Yeah. And anxiety is there to tell you, hold on, something doesn't feel right. Something doesn't matter what it is. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've worked with child soldiers in Africa.
Yes.
And they've come through some of my trainings and programs there that I would lead in Africa. And one of them shared with me that the way he was transformed from a young guy, I think he was like 9-10 years old.
Yeah.
These militias would come into their villages, and what they did to him is they blindfolded him. Firstly, they taught him how to shoot a gun, and they blindfolded him, and they put a gun in his hand, like a machine gun, and they told him, okay, now start shooting. And what they did is they lined up his family, his parents, his sisters were all lined up. He shot the gun. They removed the blindfold, and he had just shot and killed his whole family.
Yeah. And you know what they do
and he
then?
said right there,
Yeah.
said right there, the transference
Yeah.
went from his family, the shock of that.
Yeah.
He said it devastated
Of
him,
course.
traumatized him. But right there was a transference of authority over
Yes.
to the gang leaders, the new family.
Yeah.
And then they take him in, and right there they had control. That trauma that in the moment rattled him so completely. And then pretty soon he took on the identity
Yeah.
and the thinking, the new family, the group.
Yeah.
And he said it took a lot of, and then he became a killer.
Yeah.
He said he became a killer and he didn't feel anything about it because it was like, I killed my own family. I killed my mom, my dad, my siblings. And it was like, after that, it was like I was numb to killing. And he said, but he realized at a certain point, there was something underneath that even though he was bought, his very survival depended on him being accepted by the group, going along with the group, doing what the group told him to do. And at a certain point, he took that on his own thinking. But it underneath, he said he knew better. Underneath, he knew that what he was doing was wrong. But the ideology that had taken over his mind was so strong, and his very survival was so strong that he lost that for a period of time until eventually that you point to the inner anxiety of doing things he knew were not true to who he was.
Okay.
That eventually he rebelled. Eventually he escaped.
But there's something we all have to take from this lesson, which is so important. And that is, it wasn't his idea in the first place. He was tricked into doing it in the second place. And in the third place, he wasn't really responsible. It's the person who set him to do it that caused him to have this crisis, this identity crisis. We're all in a way, now this is a very extreme example, but it's real. We all are suffering from identity crisis that was set in motion, not our fault. But if we defend it, and I'm writing about this right now, the minute you realize that you have the capacity to see beyond this conditioning that you've been in your whole life, that very second that you have that capacity to realize there's something beyond this, and that in a sense, this is something you inherited. It wasn't really your idea. None of this was your idea to begin with. You adopted it, a perfect word that you use, Baron. You adopted it and it became your identity, but it's not your identity. It was what was put upon you, whatever it may be. And this is what, to disrupt this drift, is to wake up to one thing. And it's so simple. It's not your fault. Don't think that the mistakes that you've made in your life are specifically because you chose to go down the wrong paths. You went those paths. You made those bad decisions, but there was an influence at work on you. And the second you realize that there's an influence there, I talked about the airplane and the wind blowing and the sailboat and the current from the river that you're going down. You don't have to follow those impulses. You don't have to follow. The anxiety is calling you to a different life.
Yeah. I think it's a great point to wrap up. And I'll say this. So to impact the drift, you need to look at where do you need to put a dam up and stop the drifting along. What external voices, social media, what people in your life, friends in your life, family, people that are reinforcing old ways of your old conditioning, old ways of thinking, old ways of being, old ways of acting. Where do you need to put up the dam and do bigger kind of looking and thinking and redirecting, putting up a dam to that old drift and redirecting the current of your life? What kind of people do you need around you? But before even people around you, I say you have to put up the dam within yourself. You need to redirect the current, the flow of your life within yourself. One big way to do that is this word has a lot of, speaking of associations, but repentance. It's like laying down. There has to be an inner desire, an inner hunger, an inner yearning to give up old ways, step outside of that old flow, that old drift. And in yourself, you need to lay all that down. Maybe there's forgiveness that needs to happen. Maybe resentment is glue that keeps the old ways, the old conditionings intact. Get present to the resentments you have in your life and towards who? Forgiveness. Forgive. Maybe you need to forgive yourself. To your point, it's not your fault. You've inherited certain ways. You've taken on and adopted certain ways. And you look at it, you blame yourself for that. But maybe what if you just gave up blame and you just lay it all down? Lay down your old life, pick up a new one, a new way. All right. Any last words, David?
Yes, I will leave with this one idea, and I don't want to trigger anybody, but I want to just remind everybody, and this is why it's important to actually crack open your Bible once in a while. Psalm 23, 2 and 3. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. The still waters, you're talking about creating a dam. When you create a dam, you also create a still space. So until you get to the place where the dam is overflowing, you can actually sit there and be there in the still waters. And that's also from Psalms, which is be still and know. And you know what? Be still and know means someone above you has your back.
Yeah, very good. All right, you all. Thank you. Please share the show. And thank you for getting to this point. If you've gotten to this point with us, thank you. And be well, be strong, stay bold, keep disrupting and emerging into a new way of life. Yeah, growth never ends. All right. Peace out, y'all.